Hey, all right, let's get started. So, welcome again. We are so excited to have you here. We are here to talk about preparing for the CDP 2026 disclosure, how to gain consistency and efficiency across climate, nature, and regulatory reporting. My name is Susanna Pilkerton, she, her, and I'm a senior consultant with Agendi out of our San Francisco office. At Agendi, among other things, I manage our CDP knowledge repository and audit templates, and I'm really thrilled to be talking with you all today and getting prepared for another great year of reporting. Presenting with me is Rita Ali, my CDP co-lead and Agendi consultant based in London, and Alex Giorgio, another one of our London-based consultants. To give you a bit of context about Agendi ourselves, we're a specialized sustainability consultancy providing services to large organizations. We support clients through knowledge and capacity building, helping them understand their impact and supporting strategic action, enabling action, and assisting in reporting and disclosures. Some of our work includes greenhouse gas calculations, ESG materiality assessments, defining net zero strategies, and of course, CDP support. We are a CDP accredited partner and over the years have supported 50 plus clients with drafting and auditing and advising related to CDP disclosures. And in addition to CDP accreditation, we practice what we preach. Agendi is B Corp certified with commitments to the Science Based Targets Initiative in place. To give a sense of what we're going to be talking about today, Alex will be walking us through some baseline context on voluntary reporting trends and CDP disclosures. Then Rita will take us a little further through the expected updates for CDP 2026 and connections to voluntary and regulatory reporting requirements. And then I'll jump back in and talk through strategic advice to prepare for this year's disclosure. As we go through, please drop any questions you have in the Q&A function. We'll be answering as we can throughout the call and leaving time to answer live at the end. So without further ado, let's get started and get into it.
Great, thank you for the introduction, Susanna. I'll get us started. Over the next few minutes, we'll cover three things. First, trends in sustainability reporting and what is driving CDP adoption. Second, an overview of CDP itself and how scoring works. And third, some examples of CDP's minimum essential criteria. So let's begin with the bigger picture. Sustainability reporting is continuously evolving. Across this slide, you can see 6 major trends influencing voluntary disclosure. First, voluntary frameworks are increasingly being used as preparation for regulatory compliance to avoid any future mandatory reporting shocks. Second, climate reporting, especially through platforms like CDP, is often the entry point as it gives companies a good baseline for emissions accounting, risk assessment, and transition planning. Once that infrastructure exists, companies naturally expand into broader nature-related topics like biodiversity. We're seeing this with clients as their disclosures become more mature year on year. Third, multi-framework reporting is now standard practice. Most large companies we support are reporting to CDP alongside TCFD aligned disclosures, for example. This is why interoperability is becoming critical. Organizations are looking for one data set to serve multiple frameworks and stakeholders at the same time. Currently, there is a lot of framework alignment work happening in the sustainability reporting space, for example, between CDP and ISSB, which Rita will touch on in the next section. And lastly, tools like CDP and EcoVadis are being utilized by large buyers as part of procurement criteria, and these expectations are being pushed down supply chains. So with that context, let's look more specifically at CDP itself. CDP is the world's largest voluntary environmental reporting platform, and participation has reached a scale that is difficult to ignore. In 2025, more than 22,000 companies disclosed through CDP, with over 4,400 doing so for the first time. Companies representing nearly 2/3 of global market cap now disclose across themes like climate change, biodiversity, water, plastics, and forests. And importantly, disclosure is not only company-led, 640 investors representing $127 trillion in assets requested CDP data, and around 45,000 suppliers were asked to disclose through CDP's supply chain program. For companies, that means CDP responses are not just public reporting, they're also inputs into investment decisions, procurement scoring, and risk assessments. Now, this naturally raises the next question: how does CDP scoring actually work, and what differentiates a C from an A score? The scoring is designed to evaluate how well companies understand and manage their environmental impacts. There are 4 performance bands: disclosure, awareness, management, and leadership. In 2025, 877 companies reached the A list, and only 23 achieved a triple A across water, climate, and forests. So the bar is high, and it progressively gets higher as CDP improves its scoring. Now, what actually allows companies to move up these levels? Let's look at the minimum essential criteria. Essential criteria exists for every scoring band, and they must be met to be eligible for that level of scoring. For example, a C score sits within the awareness band. If awareness criteria are not met, a score above C is simply not possible. These criteria apply across themes, although some are sector specific and they are not applicable to SMEs. A few practical examples here. Within risks and opportunities, companies must demonstrate identification, assessment, and management of environmental risks across both operations and the value chain to be eligible for a C-. To move towards a B- score, CDP expects an assessment of the financial impact of those risks and opportunities. In practice, this means conducting climate-related financial risk analysis aligned with IFRS guidance, including scenario analysis, financial impact, or carbon pricing assessments. We also see alignment here with emergent regulations such as disclosure expectations under California's SB 261, which reinforces the direction of travel. On emissions, eligibility for an A- requires full scope 1, 2, and 3 disclosure with third-party verification. Best practice here is alignment with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And finally, targets. To be eligible for an A-, companies must set credible near-term targets. In most cases, this means science-based targets aligned with SBTi. These are only examples. There are additional essential criteria across, for instance, governance, policy engagement, and transition planning. So with that foundation in place, we can now turn to what is changing and what companies need to prepare for in the 2026 disclosure cycle.
Hi, everyone. So in the next few minutes, I'll go over the 2026 CDP disclosure, including updates expected in 2026, the themes and strategy, and how this connects to voluntary and mandatory frameworks. So to provide some initial context, over the last several years, the CDP has expanded its coverage to increase participation of those disclosing. So that includes introducing this SME questionnaire, which has been enhanced year over year. They've also increased its usability and expanded its scoring methodology over the last several years, expanded the thematic coverage, which includes the introduction of the oceans questions in 2026, as well as increasing alignment with voluntary and mandatory frameworks, which we'll go into further detail of how that looks in 2026. So to provide some context over the key regulations and frameworks the CDP aligns with, we've listed these across the left with the logos The tick signs show where the CDP is fully or highly aligned, and the partial symbol shows where there's partial alignment, as well as several additional frameworks on the right-hand side. So to start with, anything related to ISSB S2, IFRS, TCFD, and any associated regulations, which include the California SB 261 regulations across the first two rows of this table. These build off the original four pillars of the TCFD, which are governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And these are fully integrated within the CDP questionnaire. So this is under full alignment. To the CSRD disclosures, the CDP claims a high level of interoperability with the ESRS E1 standards, and they have a collaboration with EFRAG. So they've published a correspondence mapping here. Of course, we caveat this with the update of the ESRS E1 recently, which may require an update to the CDP's interoperability. Continuing with EU regulations, with the EU taxonomy, we see partial alignment as the CDP has piloted questions aligned with the EU taxonomy objectives in relation to sustainable finance. With voluntary disclosures, the GRI has partial alignment as well, including the GRI 102, 303, 103, and Biodiversity 101 standards. So these include disclosures across energy, water and effluents, and climate change as well. And lastly, with the TNFD, which also aligns with the Biodiversity 101 GRI standards, the CDP currently has partial alignment, but they aim to progress towards full alignment with the TNFD. They've incorporated all 14 recommendations, as well as definitions of environmental impacts and dependencies aligned with the TNFD nature-related impacts and dependencies as well. Additional frameworks in alignment on the right-hand side include the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the AFI for forests, the CEO water mandate, and the SBTN. So for example, the CDP has introduced under the water questionnaire this year, ability to disclose against SBTN targets. So all this to say, the key summary here is that the CDP is aligned with several voluntary and mandatory frameworks and can be used as a tool to consolidate data collection across all of these, which we'll get into in the next section. So several of the frameworks I just mentioned, including the TNFD, are nature-related. So we'll spend a couple of minutes going into the nature-related questions within the CDP and what that means practically. So first, to provide some context, nature risk is becoming increasingly financially material and hard to ignore. The World Bank has reported that there could be a 2.7 trillion US dollar GDP decline annually by 2030 due to ecosystem collapse. Because of how prevalent this has become, nature-related disclosure requirements are increasingly in regulatory frameworks. A recent example of this is the ISSB. They recently had a research project, which was Biodiversity Ecosystems and Ecosystem Services, or BEES, and that was voted on by all members of the ISSB to be integrated within actual disclosure requirements for S1 and S2, which several countries are uptaking in the next several years. And of course, the CDP also has aimed to expand its planetary boundaries coverage in its roadmap. So this gives context as to why the nature-related questions have been included within the CDP and will continue to expand. But what does this mean practically for CDP disclosure? So on the right-hand side here, we have some implementation guidance based on aims of disclosing to the CDP. So for example, if what we'd class as an emerging reporter is reporting and the goal is to complete the CDP climate change questionnaire, we still recommend a high-level assessment of material nature-related impacts and dependencies for a complete answer to Module 2 of the CDP, for example. To progress further, an advancing reporter has an aim to achieve leadership points in the climate questionnaire. This could be for an aim to achieve an A- score, for example. We would recommend conducting a complete LEAP assessment aligned with the TNFD requirements, because this assesses not only nature-related impacts and dependencies, but also risks and opportunities, as well as how these are interconnected, which is essential to achieve some leadership points in Module 2 as well. And what we define as a leading reporter is an organization who aims to have future-proof and completely transparent responses to the CDP questionnaire. So this would include recommended actions of responding against the biodiversity module. And practically, this means collecting location-specific biodiversity indicators data, which we've seen some clients being able to respond to based on their TNFD LEAP assessments, for example, or further analysis, as well as setting biodiversity-related commitments and tracking progress against these. Best practice here would be to align with the SBTN, for example. So keeping in mind that the biodiversity module remains unscored, but to respond to it would mean to protect against any future increasing level of disclosures. And this is also seen in the oceans-related questions this year. So in 2026, one of the main updates to the CDP questionnaire is the introduction of oceans questions within its integrated questionnaire. And this aligns with their long-term strategy to expand across planetary boundaries. But this is also reflexive of the fact that financial institutions have been calling for better ocean-related data to inform capital allocation. So examples of this include the UNEP Finance Initiative, Sustainable Blue Economy work, and the Ocean Investment Protocol. These institutions are clarifying what investors expect in terms of ocean-related impacts, dependencies, and risks. And this reflects the growing recognition that oceans are fundamental to climate stability and economic systems. As we've shown here, the ocean absorbs 30% of CO2 emissions, absorbs 90% of greenhouse gas related warming, and covers 75% of the planet. So the CDP has responded to all of this by introducing the oceans related questionnaires. Given that it's the first year of these questions being introduced, they remain unscored, but this provides an opportunity because even organizations that don't consider themselves ocean facing, they still may have material exposure through supply chains or logistics networks, for example. So we see CDP's unscored framework this year as an opportunity to start mapping ocean dependencies and impacts and future proof against expanded disclosure expectations in the future. So on top of the introduction of oceans questions, we've summarized here the updates to the CDP questionnaire in 2026. So we have this across all themes of the questionnaire, as well as whether these are in the integrated questionnaire as separate modules, part of the SME questionnaire, and whether these are scored. So as you can see here, climate change, water security, and forests are the three modules which remain scored and have separate modules. Water and forests have been introduced in the SME questionnaire for the first time in 2026. Plastics, biodiversity, and oceans all remain unscored with major updates to the plastics questionnaire this year, and plastics and biodiversity both have a separate module. So to provide some further details on the 2026 updates, so as we've been mentioning, the CDP has been expanding across its planetary boundaries, which we mentioned for oceans and for the introduction of questions in the SME questionnaire, but this also includes an expansion in the forests questionnaire, which has introduced several new commodities, which include cocoa, coffee, and rubber this year. The plastics disclosures have been expanded this year as well. And in terms of climate disclosure, on top of climate risks, we are now able to disclose adaptation and resilience related data points. The SME questionnaire has seen the most changes this year, introducing an A score for the first time. And in terms of CDP data collection, they have included AI assistance for the first time this year. So that includes a chatbot, for example, and introduced the ability to upload and download data, as well as having version control functionality. So when there's several authors contributing, you can see where question responses have been changed as compared to last year where you couldn't. The CDP supply chain membership has also been updated this year. So the key takeaway here across the updates is that the CDP has expanded its requirements across the modules and improved opportunities for SMEs responding. And we'll go into some more practical guidance of how this looks and how to respond to the questionnaire.
Exactly. Now we're going to switch from summary to action. So looking at the strategy and engagement that builds the CDP disclosure, how to effectively draft and audit responses, and what to do once you've submitted your response. So starting here, looking across how this works. We work with a number of clients across industries and we see a variety of types of responders. So as Rhoda mentioned, some of this relates to ambition level, but it also relates to how companies are approaching CDP. Those that are benefiting the most are breaking the disclosure up into those 4 key sections. So working to set a clear disclosure strategy, building lasting data collection systems, iteratively drafting and auditing reports, and integrating this disclosure into long-term plans. So to walk through each of these areas further, we'll start with arguably the most important, the disclosure strategy. So this is where companies identify strategic reporting goals, ambition levels, and boundaries of disclosure. Preparation is the foundation to a successful CDP disclosure cycle. So before wading into data and drafting, it's helpful to identify your level of ambition or the score band that you're realistically aiming for. Also, what you're comfortable disclosing publicly. It's important to just confirm which themes you're disclosing to. You might be requested to disclose to a theme that you don't want to disclose to in that year, and that's fine. It is ultimately a voluntary framework. But understanding how this will appear publicly and if there's any implications to it allows you to make an informed decision. From there, reviewing the corporate questionnaire for what you plan to disclose against, these are shown on the right, allows you to conduct a gap analysis against existing work. So for example, a materiality assessment or a greenhouse gas inventory, so that you can identify where you already have strong content and where gaps might exist. All of this helps guide where and what your time is most valuably spent on, and allows you to identify relevant stakeholders and data owners to begin discussing with. So when supporting clients on their engagement strategy, we encourage aligning requests where possible, working with stakeholder timelines, and including their other reporting priorities in your consideration when you build this plan out. So starting early, consolidating requests, and positioning CDP as part of an ongoing process rather than a last minute, more transactional data ask makes the experience just more efficient overall and supports longer term internal collaboration over time. A successful disclosure preparation process is going to bring you right into the data collection stage. So here you're going to be engaging with those prioritized stakeholders you've identified to gather data and to build data management systems. Here we're going to look a little bit more at what each theme is asking to make sure you have a very clear view and a concrete takeaway about what you should be collecting by section. But of course, this is a high-level summary. So starting with climate, which will be relevant to most disclosures, you are going to be asked about your scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, what methodology you use, what framework you align with. They'll ask you about your total energy consumption and usage and spend, as well as if you have any renewable energy procurement or if you've retired any carbon credits that year. Common thread across all themes is looking at how risks and opportunities are identified, assessed, and managed, and that includes the quantification of those impacts, and we'll talk more about that throughout these slides. For forests, the focus is on exposure to key commodities. So for example, this could be timber, palm oil, or cocoa. And so for the commodities that are relevant for your organization, CDP will ask more questions about the volume used, the percentage that's traceable to the origin, whether it's certified, and whether the company has a deforestation or conversion-free commitment. For water security, companies are asked to report total water withdrawals, discharges, and consumption, broken down by source or geography. CDP also asks companies to report if your facilities are in water-stressed areas and if or how that's managed, and again, about targets and whether any products or services are specifically water-related. As was mentioned and discussed by Alex and Rita, the CDP has some unscored areas, so plastics and biodiversities are separate specific questions, and oceans is integrated. For plastics and biodiversities, they want to know about targets, what plastics are in your value chain, and how close you are to biodiverse locations and management related to that. And oceans, again, are new this year. We're excited to see what comes and what types of questions specifically are asked in April. So again, these unscored areas are likely to grow in emphasis, and we do recommend that they're scored in, or we expect rather that they're going to be scored in the future. So we recommend preparing now while there's less pressure and less impact. So again, a high-level summary, this just gives us a touch point across themes to really emphasize the focus is not just on metrics, but on demonstrating governance, risk assessment processes, and progress against defined targets. So on the next two slides, we're going to look at how this shows up for a few of the integrated questions. So these are relevant for all themes. So here we're going to start with understanding both how the environment impacts your business and how your business impacts the environment. And this is a key component of the CDP disclosure. So the types of questions you'll be asked about focus on identification, assessment, and management, as well as interconnections and substantive effects. For example, the proportion of how your finance is impacted related to these items. Bringing back in those reporting areas we talked about earlier on, these requests rely with several regulations and voluntary frameworks, so you can both pull from these or prepare for these depending on where you're at in your disclosure cycle through the CDP disclosure. Finally, when preparing for responses in these areas, depending on what's going on in your company, we typically talk to these internal stakeholders, so finance, operations, risk management, and procurement. Looking at another example here for governance, again, relevant for all themes and a key theme of CDP disclosure. They want to know about the organizational structures, the oversight mechanisms, and the accountability frameworks that guide how your company is identifying and managing and reporting on environmental issues. These requests include who has oversight on environmental areas, what level of environmental competency leadership has, as well as any incentives that are tied to the environmental areas you're reporting on. The connections here are the same as on the regulation side, but on the voluntary side, adding in the transition plan. So if you're in the UK and that's on the radar, or anywhere really, this can be a great place to start on that reporting journey. And on the stakeholder side, we typically bring in finance, legal, human resources, and communications teams to support these requests. Before we move forward into the drafting and auditing, just bringing this back together, the point here is that CDP is comprehensive. It provides a resource to adapt and grow your sustainability report, but it has a lot of components. And so building a structured data collection process across these themes can make your responses and your time more efficient and reduce burden in future years, not just for CDP, but for all of your reporting. So moving on to data and drafting and auditing. Once you've got your disclosure prepared, you have your data collected, it's time to get going on the CDP platform. And here I want to start with what an audit is. So you've heard us say it a few times, but looking more at what this actually means, an audit considers each drafted response by question, assessing against the full CDP questionnaire and scoring. So on the left, you can see the 3 key areas that CDP publishes that allow us to do this. So the full questionnaire provides each question. It's released earlier than the other 2, and it gives guidance on how to respond, especially for qualitative questions where there's a specific request on what you're writing. Scoring methodology outlines how many points are available based on your response, and these components can both be qualitative and quantitative. And as we discussed earlier, essential criteria is critical and outlines specific necessary questions tied to each disclosure level. Looking at an example here in a faux draft and audit for an integrated question to get a sense of what this looks like for a full audit, question 2.2.1 in module 2 is asking if your organization has a process for identifying, assessing, and managing environmental risks and opportunities. So again, that really core theme of CDP. On the drafting side, CDP is asking clients to, via dropdown, respond if they have a process in place, if risks or opportunities are evaluated, and if the process is informed by your process to identify and assess dependencies and impacts. So looking for that correlation and interconnection. If it's a no to any of these, then they have a qualitative response area, noting the primary reason for not evaluating and then explanations for reasons or plans to in the future. On the scoring side, happily, this is one of the ones for disclosure. You just need everything to be completed, but those qualitative answers do need to be written in the way that CDP is asking. So there are some checks there still, but disclosure truly is disclosure. For awareness, you need to have full disclosure points. You must have a process for risks and opportunities assessments in place to get full points, or if you have one or the other or plan to in future years, you can get partial points. And then finally, on the essential criteria, since this is just a disclosure and awareness scoring for this question specifically, to get past an awareness score, or to get an awareness score rather, above a D, you must have a process in place for identifying, assessing, and managing environmental risks or opportunities. So again, this is just one example here, but it's a good example to bring it back to the strategy and the reason for potentially considering CDP. So this is a good example of the things we lead clients through each question goes through this stage, and the drafting and auditing stages ideally will build on each other to optimize your CDP disclosure. Audits identify where simple fixes like wording or additional context can add points for this year's disclosure, while other actions might require longer-term updates and then become an automatic opportunity point and an identification for strategy conversations. Want to know, of course, scores should not be the only reason that you are reporting to CDP, but they shouldn't be overlooked either. They are a valuable benchmark that helps you compare to peers and exemplify your value to the relevant stakeholders. Working upwards on the scoring trajectory is something we help clients with, whether that's on how to respond this year or, again, those larger strategic updates. So getting to our fourth step, again, not just score, but impact. Here we want to use CDP to build momentum and track your progress, but continuing on that natural journey. As we just discussed, the CDP audit gives you clearly marked and continuously updated goals to work towards. That's another benefit, is that they update and improve and make it harder, honestly, to get a high score each year, which means that you have someone else doing that work to see what's important that year, what are investors asking for, and a guideline to follow. For any items that either didn't reach full points or require annual or biannual updates, that gives you, again, a cheat sheet to bring to your strategic planning sessions. So giving a few examples similar to where we started, bringing it back together here, a few examples of common misscoring areas we see. So for governance, implementing an incentive plan is an action you can take, updating leadership level training to make sure there's that competency on the environmental areas they're overseeing. On business strategy, getting into a climate transition plan again, working with frameworks to publish and produce a clear plan. And on value chain engagement, suppliers must be engaged on environmental issues to get an A-list criteria. And so maybe you're engaging, but you need to get more percentage of suppliers involved. Maybe you need to start that journey. We will share these slides after, so there's a few examples of how to break this out over short, medium, and long term, very high level, but just a sense of what kind of things come out of the CDP disclosure. And finally, wrapping this all up, this is all great in theory, but of course, we all know in sustainability, disclosure fatigue is very common. And so what we want to avoid is a drop-off after that CDP submission in September. So as your disclosure draws to a close, we recommend refocusing and reinvigorating around 3 key areas. So first is fostering and maintaining stakeholder relationships, set regular touch points with your data owners and internal stakeholders. And again, getting back to the co-integration of goals, you want to make sure you're moving the same direction as a company or developing goals together with external partners, working to make this a long-term relationship. Next is building and strengthening your systems. We've talked about this a few times, but this can really help year-round metrics tracking and also reduce the need to start from scratch each year. So you've already gone through the process of talking to stakeholders to get this data. Now you want to build that out and make sure it continues long-term. And finally, the audit process, again, should serve as an annual renewal point. It's a great natural checkpoint. So late September, scheduling your strategic updates and any kind of strategy conversations you have in late September after the CDP disclosure, after peers have likely published their sustainability reports, and you can have those conversations fully informed. We are going to get into the last section here, just put a nice bow on what we're talking about, summarize a few key points, and look at the timeline. So a few key dates keep in mind. In April, the CDP will be releasing the guidance, questionnaire, and scoring methodology, so you can start that gap analysis. Week of June 15th is when the platform will open and you can officially start responding to the CDP 2026 disclosure. If you want a score, that will close on September 14th or the week of September 14th. And the week of October 26th is the final deadline. If you want to use CDP for just a benchmark exercise, but you don't want to score, you can still respond until October 26th. And this all culminates the week of November 30th when public and private scores will be available. Given this timeline, if you are considering external support or a third party, we recommend reaching out by the end of March, early April to ensure you're fully prepared for the new reporting cycle. Internally, again, it's helpful to begin thinking about your data collection process after that questionnaire is released and you get going on a gap analysis. So with that, I'm going to stop talking in a moment. We'd love to hear what questions have come up for you. If you want to have any one-on-one conversations or have any questions you'd rather not share with a larger group, we have a couple ways to get in touch, either with one of our offices specifically or scheduling a one-on-one CDP consultation, depending on which time zone you work in or which is the best fit. We have two options here. But yes, I'd love to hear. I know Rita and Alex have been looking at the Q&A throughout. So what questions have come up?
So we have one question about clarification on how to progress to the next score. So for example, management or leadership. So one of the ways to do that, as we mentioned before, was on the essential criteria. So there's essential criteria at each level of disclosure. So awareness essential criteria, for example, caps you at an awareness score overall, as Alex mentioned in some of the earlier slide, and then these progress above. There's also specific A-list criteria for those. And there's also a specific number of points you need to get to progress between each level. So for example, to progress between a D and a C and a B, and etc. The CDP has separate bands for these. They have not released these for 2026, but for 25, for example, to get an awareness score overall, you needed over 80% disclosure points, and these increase at a banded level. So 80% awareness points to get a management score, over 75% management points to get above a B, and then over 70% leadership to get a leadership, so over an A minus. Susanna, let me know if I've missed anything or if you have anything to add.
No, I think that's a perfect overview. The only thing I would add there is that just to make it very clear, each point or each question is scored, and so that banded level that Rita was talking about is the full summary of all the points you've had across questions, and then on top of it is the essential criteria. So separate things, but everything else perfect. Great. I see we have another question about essential criteria. So does CDP update essential criteria for 2026? Yes, we expect a few changes. One of those, for example, is to the incentives for governance, and they're changing how they're wording that one specifically. And I think, Rita, you have that open on the side. There's a few other minor changes, but overall, we expect most of these to be the same as 2025.
Yep, exactly. I think you mostly covered it. The changes will be due to any of the changes within the questionnaire as well, and they'll provide more detail on that when this is released.
Yep, that's true. So some of the essential criteria themselves may not change, but the questions tied to them might have slight wording adjustments or methodology requests. And that will be an answer we can give in April when the scoring and questionnaire guidance is given. Are questions expected to change vastly this year? They are not. A few years ago, if you have been following CDP, you'll have seen that that was when that integrated questionnaire was released. And so there was a major shift in the questions asking, and it was a big change year and a big disclosure request for all companies. But now moving into 2026, they're relatively stable. Looking at the strategy that Rita and Alex talked about earlier on in the presentation, they've reached a lot of their goals. They've gotten to the end of their 5-year strategy updates. And so for now, we see it as relatively stable. And we do expect some changes or some new strategy updates in maybe 2026 or 2027, just given that they've reached the end of their 5-year strategy, but no official answers from them on that yet. Wonderful. Rita and Alex, maybe since we have a few moments, is there anything that has really supported or helped clients you've worked with on CDP that you'd want to give us a tip and trick for those attending and thinking about disclosing in 2026?
That is a great question. I think that the first thing is to engage stakeholders early because if there's many different requirements across different departments, for example, or have for example, even when it comes to the supplier questionnaire with the customer requests and being able to get those financial metrics that are required. So especially if responding year on year, just to remind those stakeholders that CDP is coming up and that there may be some data requests coming in. I think another thing as well is to start with to align the data collection across frameworks, as we mentioned. So if we can use that as a strategic tool and see where the frameworks that are already being responded to outside of CDP are aligned, that could be a great way to kind of organize everything and be prepared for the disclosure.
Yeah, that's a great answer. One thing we didn't mention is when you're doing that iterative draft and audit, so doing a few rounds of a draft, audit, redraft, it's good to have leadership or whoever is approving the final submission go through and approve questions as they reach their final point. So if you are done drafting, you've gotten the highest level of points you can for that year, then leadership can preemptively go in and mark on the platform approved. And we find that this really helps the September deadline, just so whoever is approving doesn't need to go through every question, just the few that they haven't reached at that point. I see we have one more question on ocean. So what assessment methodologies are you using to develop responses for ocean questionnaires? Is this the TNFD LEAP?
So we'll have more clarity on this when we receive the actual finalized questionnaires, but in for partially yes for the TNFD LEAP, because TNFD will assess the impacts and dependencies related to all planetary boundaries, which could include oceans as well. But I think once we have the questionnaire and see what guidance is recommended and has been used to develop those questions, then we'll have a bit more clarity on that as well. Sorry, Suzanne, I know you had something else.
No, that's almost exactly what I was going to say, so that's perfect. We're aligned. Amazing. Alex, on your side, anything that's really supported for CDP disclosures over the last years?
I think Rida had summarized it quite well, but yeah, if I could succinctly say it, it would be to plan ahead, make sure that you're consolidating any of the data requirements early on, so that you're prepared, and when it comes to that disclosure cycle, you know what you need to report on, as well as be prepared for any sort of additional iterations once you understand the scoring.
Absolutely. And then how much overlap are you seeing between CDP, EcoVadis, and GRESB in 2026? Rita, I see that you've marked this as an answer live.
So in terms of EcoVadis, we can answer that question. With the supply chain module, EcoVadis has some overlap with the supplier related questions as well, especially when it comes to the climate related questions. EcoVadis also requests, for example, emissions related questions. Something different with EcoVadis is it also focuses a lot on the S side, like the social requirements. So there will also be requirements, for example, to look at employee trainings and the frequency of those. So that is a lot more specific in EcoVadis on the S&G side that may not be as covered by CDP. So that I can speak to from experience.
Absolutely. And on the GRESB side, I'd say probably most relates to more of the energy and the building specific. And we have reached our time. So thank you all again so much for joining us today. Again, please get in touch if you have any specific questions. A few of those that came up at the end, I think they like how to get up higher in your score for management, how to move to leadership, how this relates specifically for you and the frameworks you're working on. Those are great questions to have more context on to be able to answer more thoroughly. So thank you all again so much for joining us today. We will be sharing the recording with you all, and have a great rest of your Friday or your weekends, depending on what time zone you're in. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.